Virginia Collins had buried her husband in ground so hard and dry, it took her 3 hours and a broken shovel handle to dig a hole deep enough. And when she was done, she did not cry. She simply picked up the reins of the remaining mule and kept walking west. That was the spring of 1873, somewhere between the Missouri River crossing and the stretch of Kansas prairie that seemed to have no end and no mercy. The Oregon Trail had already claimed 22 souls from their wagon train before it took Thomas Collins, and Virginia had watched each of those deaths with a growing sense of outrage that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with fury. Fury at the land, at the weather, at the cholera that moved through a camp like a silent thief, at the wagon master who had made poor decisions, at the water holes that were brackish and vile, at the sun that beat down without apology. It was that fury that kept her feet moving when others lay down. It was that fury that made her boil every drop of water, even when the other women called her eccentric and wasteful of firewood. It was that fury that saved her life 4 times over, while men twice her size and half her stubbornness perished on that merciless stretch of American earth. She was 29 years old when Thomas died, and she was 30 years old when she finally crossed into the Oregon Territory, the last survivor from her original group of 7 wagons, the only one who had made it to the land that had been promised in the pamphlets back in Ohio, where she and Thomas had read them together by candlelight and dreamed of something better. Better. She almost laughed at the word now. The settlement she arrived at was called Harlan's Creek, which was optimistic because the creek was barely a trickle by August, but the town itself had some substance to it. There was a general store run by a man named Weatherspoon who charged prices that would have made a river pirate blush. There was a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, a boarding house run by a Mrs. Aldous Pemberton who took in women of good reputation, and there was a saloon called the Yellow Rose that served whiskey of debatable quality and employed 3 women who played cards better than any man in the territory. There was also a small church with a roof that leaked when it rained, and a preacher named Holloway who delivered sermons of considerable length and uncertain theological soundness. And then there was the marshal's office, a low wooden building with a crooked star nailed above the door and a porch that needed replanking, which was where Virginia first laid eyes on Cornelius Yates. She had not gone there looking for him. She had gone there because 2 men from a passing cattle drive had attempted to take her remaining mule while she was purchasing flour at Weatherspoon's store, and Virginia Collins had fought them with the full force of her considerable anger, ending the altercation with one man's nose dramatically rearranged, and the other seated in the dirt with a flour sack over his head. The marshal had been summoned, which meant Cornelius Yates had arrived at a scene of minor chaos with flour dust still hanging in the air and Virginia standing in the center of it with her fists still clenched. He was 34 years old, tall in the way of men who had grown up working hard and had never stopped, with dark hair that was starting to show threads of silver at the temples, and eyes the particular gray-green color of sage after rain. He wore a badge that had seen better days, and a hat that had been through everything the territory had to offer. He looked at the scene before him, the 2 cattle drovers in varying states of embarrassment and injury, the indignant storekeeper, the cloud of flour, and Virginia Collins standing in the middle of it all like a woman who had decided the world owed her an apology, and he did something unexpected. He almost smiled. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Cornelius Yates, Marshal of Harlan's Creek. Would you like to tell me what happened here, or should I piece it together from the flour?" Virginia looked at him with the steady, measuring gaze she had developed over 1,000 miles of hard country. "Those 2 men attempted to steal my mule. I discouraged them." "I see that," Cornelius said, looking at the drover with the flour sack still half on his head. "Effectively, I was not in the mood to be robbed today, Marshal. Are you ever in the mood?" "No," she said flatly, "but especially not today." He sorted the matter out with the efficiency of a man who had handled worse, sent the cattle drovers on their way with a warning that carried enough weight to be taken seriously, and then turned back to Virginia with that same expression that was not quite a smile but was something adjacent to it. "You're new to Harlan's Creek," he said. It was not a question. "I arrived this morning. From Ohio originally. The trail most recently." She said it without inflection, the way you say something that is simply true and no longer requires emotional ornamentation. Something shifted in his expression at that. Not pity, she would have walked away from pity immediately. It was something quieter and more careful. "The Oregon Trail, what remains of it after this season?" He looked at her for a moment with those sage-colored eyes. "Where are you headed?" Virginia picked up the flower she had purchased, tucked it under her arm with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had been carrying her own weight for a long time, and said, "I am already here, Marshal. This is where I stopped walking." She walked away and did not look back, because looking back was a habit she had worked very hard to break. She settled into Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house in a small room on the second floor that looked out over the main street. The room had a wash basin, a narrow bed, a window that stuck when it rained, and more privacy than she had known in 6 months on the trail. Virginia sat on the edge of the bed that first evening and listened to the sounds of Harlan's Creek settling into night, the distant notes from the Yellow Rose's tinny piano, the horses shifting in the livery, the wind that never entirely stopped moving across the Kansas plain, and she thought about what came next. Thomas had wanted to farm. They had talked about it endlessly, making their plans in the lamplight of their Ohio kitchen, sketching out what the land would look like, where the house would stand, how many head of cattle they would run. Thomas had been a gentle, patient man with large hands and a laugh that came easily, and a fundamental belief that hard work would be rewarded. He had been wrong about the last part, at least as far as the trail was concerned, but Virginia had never blamed him for believing it. A man had to believe in something or the world became unmanageable. She had loved Thomas. She had loved him practically and completely, and without the sort of theatrical excess that she distrusted in herself and others. She had loved him the way you love the only reliable thing in an unreliable world, and losing him had not broken her because she had made the active decision not to break. She had channeled every ounce of grief into fury, and the fury had gotten her here, and now the fury was beginning, very slowly, to quiet down. That quieting frightened her more than the grief had. She found work within the week. Mrs. Pemberton ran a small laundry operation out of the boarding house, and Virginia took over the books and the negotiations with clients, since Mrs. Pemberton was warm-hearted but numerically disadvantaged, and had been systematically undercharging everyone for 3 years. Virginia reorganized the pricing, collected what was owed, and increased the monthly revenue by an amount that made Mrs. Pemberton weep with gratitude and offer Virginia a permanent room at a reduced rate. She also began taking in sewing, because she had a talent for it that she had never much valued in Ohio, but that was worth genuine money in a frontier town where most people's clothing was held together by optimism and prayers. Within a month, she had established herself in Harlan's Creek with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned that the only person she could reliably depend on was herself. The townspeople liked her, or most of them did. She was capable and honest and direct in a way that some found refreshing and others found unnerving, and she had a sense of humor that appeared so unexpectedly it often caught people off guard, like finding a spring in dry ground. Cornelius Yates she saw regularly, because Harlan's Creek was not a large town, and because his rounds brought him past the boarding house most mornings. He was always polite. He always touched the brim of his hat. He never pressed for conversation but seemed genuinely pleased when it occurred, which it did more and more often as the weeks passed. She learned his history in pieces, the way you learn the history of a landscape, a detail here, a feature there, until the whole becomes legible. He had come from Virginia, which she found privately amusing since that was also her name. He had served in the war on the Union side, which had taken him west and then kept him there, because going back east after what he had seen felt impossible. He had been a deputy in 3 different towns before Harlan's Creek, and had taken the marshal's position here 4 years ago when the previous marshal had retired to Missouri with a bad hip and a worse temper. He had never been married. She learned this not from him but from Mrs. Pemberton, who had opinions about everyone in Harlan's Creek and shared them with the generosity of a woman who believed information was a gift. He was engaged once, Mrs. Pemberton told her over breakfast one morning, pouring coffee with the practiced accuracy of someone who had done it 10,000 times, to a girl in Abilene, but she couldn't manage the frontier life and went back east, and he stayed. That was 6 years ago. Since then he's kept mostly to himself, except for his work. Virginia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and said nothing, because she was not yet sure what she thought about this information, or whether she had any right to think anything about it at all. She had been in Harlan's Creek for almost 2 months when the first real conversation happened. Not the polite morning exchanges or the occasional brief talk in the store, but a real conversation, the kind where both people actually say something they mean. It was an October evening, cool enough for the first time that the air had a proper crispness to it, and Virginia had gone to sit on the boarding house porch because she did that sometimes when the walls felt close. She was thinking about Ohio, not in a homesick way but in the distant analytical way she sometimes revisited the past, when Cornelius came along the street at the end of his evening rounds and stopped at the porch steps. "Evening, Mrs. Collins." "Marshal." He stood for a moment as if deciding something, and then he said, "May I?" and nodded at the empty chair beside hers. She considered him for a moment. "Yes." He sat down and stretched his long legs out in front of him and looked at the darkening sky above the rooftops of Harlan's Creek with the ease of a man who was comfortable with silence. Virginia appreciated that. She had lived with too much unnecessary noise on the trail, people filling silence with noise, because silence reminded them of all they were afraid of. They sat together for a while without talking, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the night, and then he said, "You came from the trail this season." "Yes." "You came alone." "My husband died." She said it plainly, not inviting sympathy but not hiding from the truth either. "Cholera, somewhere in Kansas." "I'm sorry," he said, and the way he said it was direct and simple and unadorned, which was the only way she could have received it without flinching. "Thank you." Another silence. Then he said, "There were others from your train. There were 61 people when we started, 7 wagons." She paused. "I was the only one who finished." He turned his head to look at her then, and she could see the weight of that number land on him the way it still sometimes landed on her in the quiet hours. 61 people, he said. "Yes." "How did you survive it?" She had been asked this question before by Mrs. Pemberton, by the women who came to drop off their laundry, by the preacher Holloway who had wanted to attribute it to divine providence. She had given different answers to different people, careful answers, polite answers. But sitting in the October dark with this man who seemed to have a gift for honest weight, she gave the true answer. "Anger," she said. He did not recoil or look puzzled or offer the patronizing smile she had gotten from others. He just looked at her steadily and said, "Tell me." So she did. Not all of it, not the parts that were still too raw, not the specific texture of Thomas's last days, not the particular sound the shovel made against the hard Kansas ground. But the shape of it, the way the anger had been cleaner and more useful than grief, the way grief made you want to lie down and the anger made you want to stand up, the way she had turned every loss and every hardship into fuel, the way she had refused to let the trail take her because that would have meant the trail won, and she was not prepared to let it win. When she finished, the night had deepened around them and the stars had come out in that enormous western sky that still startled her with its magnitude. Cornelius was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I understand that." She looked at him. "Not a trail," he said, "a war, but the same arithmetic." He looked up at the stars. "Everyone around me trying to lie down and die, and me too angry at all of it to do the same. A pause. Anger is underrated as a survival mechanism. It is, she said. The preachers try to talk you out of it. Preachers never had to bury someone in ground that didn't want to be dug, he said. The words were so exactly right that she felt something shift inside her, some small mechanism that had been braced for a very long time loosening the smallest degree. She looked at him in the dark and thought that this was a man who knew what she was talking about from the inside, not from the outside, and that was an extraordinarily rare thing. No, she said, they haven't. After that evening, something changed between them, though it changed with the deliberate slowness of two people who had both learned caution the hard way. They were no longer simply polite acquaintances. They were something more careful and more honest than that. He began stopping at the porch in the evenings more regularly, and she began expecting him, and neither of them commented on this pattern, because commenting on it would have required naming something that both of them were still examining from a cautious distance. They talked about the town, about the people in it, about the territory. He told her about cases he had handled, and she found that his approach to justice was both principled and practical, which she respected. He listened when she talked about her plans for the laundry business and the sewing, and he listened with the focused attention of someone who found the subject genuinely interesting rather than the wandering half-attention that most men gave to conversations about a woman's work. She told him about Thomas sometimes, in small pieces, because she thought Thomas deserved to be remembered by more than her solitary grief. And Cornelius listened to those pieces with the same steady attention, never trying to fill the spaces with reassurance or redirect her toward optimism. He simply received what she offered and kept it carefully, the way you keep something that matters. In November, a problem arrived in Harlan's Creek in the form of a man named Dade Holcomb. Holcomb was a land speculator from back east who had gotten wind of a proposed railroad route that would, if it came through, make certain parcels of land in the Harlan's Creek area extraordinarily valuable. He had arrived with two companions whose function appeared to be primarily decorative in a threatening sort of way, and he had immediately begun making offers on property offers that were presented with the kind of friendly pressure that made the word offer do a lot of uncomfortable work. Mrs. Pemberton was his first target, since the boarding house sat on a prime corner lot. Virginia had been there when Holcomb arrived, and she had watched the performance of his persuasion with cold, clear eyes and a growing distaste. He was the type who smiled with his mouth and not his eyes, and spoke in a register of cheerful certainty that was designed to make resistance feel futile. "The railroad is coming through regardless, ma'am," he said to Mrs. Pemberton, with the smooth confidence of a man who had said this particular sentence many times before. "The question is simply whether you benefit from it or get left behind." Mrs. Pemberton, who was fundamentally warm-hearted and not equipped for this particular variety of pressure, was beginning to look uncertain, and Virginia set down the hem she was sewing and said clearly, "That's a false choice, Mr. Holcomb." He turned to look at her with the slightly surprised expression of a man unaccustomed to being interrupted by women. "I beg your pardon." "You've presented two options as if they're the only ones," Virginia said, meeting his smile with a direct, level look. "But there are others. She could hold the property and negotiate with the railroad directly if and when they arrive. She could consult a land agent about the actual value of what she holds. She could speak with a lawyer about her rights. The railroad being proposed and the railroad arriving are different things." She paused. "And your timeline is your timeline, not hers." Holcomb's friendly expression acquired a layer of something harder underneath it. "You're very well informed for he began. "For a woman," Virginia said pleasantly. "Yes, I am." She told Cornelius about it that evening on the porch, and his expression as she described it shifted from attentive to focused in a way she had come to recognize as him taking something seriously. "Holcomb," he said. "I've heard the name. He was involved in some land matters in Abilene 3 years ago that didn't resolve well for the original owners." "He's good at what he does," Virginia said. "That's what makes him dangerous. He seems reasonable right up until the moment he isn't. I'll look into him." He paused. "You handled that well. Mrs. Pemberton needed someone to handle it. That's not why I said it." She looked at him. There was something in his voice that was different from the usual tone of their conversations, something more direct and more personal, and she felt it land somewhere in the middle of her chest with a warmth that surprised her. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had of looking at her, steady and without performance, and then he said, "Virginia." It was the first time he had used her first name, and the way he said it was careful and deliberate, as if he had been thinking about saying it for some time. "Cornelius," she said, just as deliberately. The evening had gotten considerably colder, and she pulled her shawl tighter, and they sat there in the dark for another hour talking about absolutely nothing of practical importance and everything of considerable personal importance. And when she finally went inside, she stood in her small room with her hand flat against the wallpaper and breathed slowly until her heartbeat returned to its usual sensible rhythm. She was not ready for this. She was also, she suspected, already in the middle of it. The Holcomb situation developed through November with the steady creep of something that has decided it is not going away. He made additional offers to other property owners in Harlan's Creek, and while some accepted, the blacksmith, who wanted to retire, and old Mr. Carnahan, who had been wanting to move to his daughter's place in Missouri for 2 years, others were uneasy and uncertain. Cornelius investigated his background with the methodical thoroughness that Virginia had come to recognize as characteristic of everything he did, and found enough questionable history to warrant a close watch, though not yet enough for direct legal action. Meanwhile, Virginia had a different problem, which arrived in the form of a letter. The letter was from Thomas's brother, a man named Edmund Collins who lived in Cincinnati and had opinions about everything, including, apparently, what Virginia ought to do with the remainder of her life. The letter was long and detailed and contained, buried in the 4th paragraph between a description of Edmund's own impressive real estate holdings and a commentary on the moral state of the Western Territories, a suggestion that Virginia should return to Ohio, where Edmund could arrange a suitable match that would provide the security appropriate to a woman of her circumstances. Virginia read the letter twice, then folded it with precise, controlled movements and put it in the bottom of her travel case, which was where she kept things she needed to deal with eventually. She mentioned it to Cornelius that evening, not because she needed his advice, but because she had found herself wanting to tell him things, the way you find yourself turning toward a particular window for the light. "My late husband's brother has written to suggest I return to Ohio and be suitably matched," she said, without particular inflection. Cornelius was quiet for a moment. "And what do you think about that?" "I think it is not his decision to make." "No," he agreed. "I think I buried my husband in Kansas and walked the rest of the way to Oregon Territory, and I did not do that so that a man I barely know could arrange my life like a furniture placement." "No," he said again, and she could hear something in his voice that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it, a kind of warm recognition. "I think Harlan's Creek is where I live now," she said. "I think I am making something here." She paused. "I think Ohio is where I came from, not where I belong." He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight from the boarding house window his face had an expression she had not seen on it before, something open and unguarded and quietly, carefully hopeful. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I know that's a simple thing to say." "Simple things are often the truest ones," she said. They sat in that truth for a moment, both of them very still, the way you hold still when something fragile and important is in the room with you. December came and brought the first hard frost and a kind of beautiful severity to the Kansas plain that Virginia found she could appreciate now that she was looking at it from inside a warm building, rather than from the open ground of a failing wagon train. She had settled properly into Harlan's Creek by now, had made something that functioned as a life, her work, her routines, her friendships with Mrs. Pemberton and a few of the other women in town, and the evenings on the porch that had moved indoors now that the cold had arrived, Cornelia sitting across from her at the small table in Mrs. Pemberton's parlor, where Mrs. Pemberton was always conveniently occupied in the next room. They talked differently now than they had in October. There was more ease in it, the ease of two people who had moved past the polite exterior into something more real and more comfortable. He told her things he did not seem to tell other people about the war, in careful small pieces, about the particular weight of carrying responsibility for a whole town's safety, about his hopes for the territory, which were substantial and genuine, and not the performative optimism that many men displayed, but the honest, considered hope of someone who had seen enough of the worst to be genuinely grateful for anything better. She told him things she had not told other people either. About Thomas, but also about herself, about Ohio and what she had wanted from life when she was young and what she had gotten instead, and how she was beginning to think that the shape of a life was rarely the shape you had drawn for it in advance, and how that could be grief or it could be something else, depending on how you chose to hold it. "Do you miss him?" Cornelius asked one evening, and his voice when he asked it was careful and honest, not afraid of the answer. "Yes," she said. "I miss who he was and what we were together. I don't miss what the trail took from him before he died, because what it took was everything good about him and left only pain." She looked down at her hands. "I buried the pain in Kansas. I brought the good memories with me." "That seems right," he said. "I don't know if it's right," she admitted, "but it's what I have." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and his hand was warm and large and steady in the way that all of him was steady, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand over under his and looked at him across the small table with the parlor lamp between them, throwing its warm, contained light, and she thought that this was perhaps the most dangerous thing she had done since the trail, not because it might kill her, but because it might mean something. And meaning something required a kind of courage that was different from the angry survival courage she had been running on for a year. "Cornelius," she said. "Virginia." She turned her hand over under his, lacing her fingers through his. "I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing," she said honestly. "Neither am I," he said equally honestly. "But I think it's the right direction." She almost laughed, and the almost laugh softened her face in a way she rarely let it soften, and he looked at her as if this was the most important thing he had seen in some time. The Holcomb matter came to a head just before Christmas. One of Holcomb's associates, a rangy, unpleasant man named Cutter, had been found to have been selectively destroying property markers on the edge of town, which was a serious offense with legal consequences that Cornelius pursued immediately and without hesitation. Holcomb himself, when confronted, dropped the friendly persuasion register entirely and replaced it with something harder and less pleasant to deal with. Virginia had been at the marshal's office when this confrontation occurred, having brought Cornelius the documents she had gathered. She had spent 2 weeks quietly collecting signed statements from property owners about the pressure they had received, organizing them with the same meticulous attention she brought to the laundry accounts. And she was in the corner of the room when Holcomb came in with his 2 associates and made several statements about what was and was not the marshal's business in language that was not quite threatening enough to be legally actionable, but was close enough to be clear. Cornelius listened to all of it with complete calm. When Holcomb finished, Cornelius said, "Your man Cutter is in my jail. You have until tomorrow morning to be on the road east, or I will be filing a formal complaint about the interference with property markers that includes your name as the directing party. I have statements from 11 property owners about the nature of the pressure applied to them. That is a matter for the territorial court, Mr. Holcomb, and I believe the territorial judge, who is an old acquaintance of mine, will find it very interesting reading." Holcomb left. He was on the road east the next morning, and Cutter followed him after Cornelius finished processing the paperwork, and Harlan's Creek settled back to its ordinary rhythms with a collective sense of relief that manifested as several people bringing food to the marshal's office, which was apparently how this particular community expressed gratitude. Virginia appeared with a pie that Mrs. Pemberton had baked and she had carried. "Mrs. Pemberton wanted you to have this," she said, setting it on his desk. "Mrs. Pemberton is very kind," he looked at her, "and the statements from 11 property owners. Mrs. Pemberton is also a very good organizer." Virginia. "I had time on my hands," she said, and this time the almost laugh became an actual one, and his face when she laughed did something she had not seen it do before. It became, very simply, happy. Christmas in Harlan's Creek was modest and genuine, the way Christmas is in a place where people don't have much surplus but have decided to celebrate anyway because the alternative is to let the winter be only cold and dark. The church was full for the Christmas service despite the leaking roof, and Preacher Holloway delivered a sermon that was, for once, appropriately brief. There was a gathering at the saloon. The Yellow Rose was temporarily repurposed for the occasion with decorations of questionable aesthetic value, but abundant holiday spirit, and Mrs. Pemberton made a dinner that was extraordinary given her resources. Cornelius came to Mrs. Pemberton's dinner, which was not unusual. He had eaten there several times since October, but he arrived with a small package wrapped in brown paper that he gave to Virginia with the careful offhandedness of someone trying not to make a larger gesture than the moment could bear. She opened it at the table, with Mrs. Pemberton watching from the kitchen doorway with transparent delight, and found inside a small leather-bound book, a collection of poems, the pages slightly worn, clearly owned before but carefully maintained. She looked up at him. "I've had it a long time," he said with the careful evenness of someone keeping their voice in order. "I thought you might enjoy it. You mentioned once that you used to read poetry in Ohio." "I did," she said. She looked at the book. "I lost all my books on the trail." She paused. "Everything I was carrying had to be lightened." "I know," he said. "That's why." She held the book in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of the gesture, not just the gift itself but what it said, which was that he had been listening, had remembered, had acted on what he remembered. She felt the warmth of it move through her with the slow, certain heat of something that had been building for a long time. "Thank you, Cornelius," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "You're welcome, Virginia," he said, and his was not entirely steady either, which felt important. After dinner, when Mrs. Pemberton had been persuaded to go to bed, and they were the last two people at the table with the last lamp burning and the December cold pressing against the window panes, Virginia opened the book to a random page and read a few lines aloud, and then Cornelius read a few lines, and they did this for an hour, passing the book back and forth across the remnants of a Christmas dinner, taking turns with the words, and Virginia thought that this was the most peaceful she had felt since before the trail, and the most present and the most honest. "I want to tell you something," he said at last, when the lamp was getting low and she was going to have to go upstairs soon. She looked at him. "I have not been easy to know," he said. "I've been told that. I know it's true. I'm not quick to talk about things that matter, and I keep my own company more than is probably healthy, and I have stayed in this town in this particular life for 4 years partly because I couldn't decide what else to do." He paused, looking at the table with the direct honesty that was his particular character. "And then you arrived in my town and argued with a cattle drover over a mule and stood in a flower cloud like you owned the territory. And I thought, that is a person who is actually alive." Virginia felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with something considerably more complicated and more welcome. "You said that wrong," she said, carefully. He looked up. "You said you couldn't decide what else to do, but you built something here. You protect this town and you do it well and you care about it and the people in it, and that's not a man who doesn't know what to do. That's a man who knows exactly what he's doing and has been waiting for the right reason to care about it even more." She held his gaze. "That's different." He was quiet for a long moment. "You see things clearly," he said. "I had to learn to," she said. "The trail doesn't leave you much room for comfortable illusions." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his as he had done before, and this time she turned to look at him and he looked at her, and the small, warm, lamplit room felt like the most private place in the world, just the two of them and the cold dark outside and the light between them. "Virginia," he said. "Don't say something careful," she said quietly. "Not right now." He stood up, and she stood up, and they were very close in that small room, and he took her face in his hands with a gentleness that surprised her for a man of his size and steadiness, and he kissed her in the lamplight with the careful certainty of someone who has been thinking about the right moment for a long time, and has finally decided that the right moment is now. It was a quiet kiss and a tender one, and it undid something in her that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and when it ended, she stood with her forehead against his and breathed and thought about anger and survival, and the strange mercy of ending up somewhere you hadn't planned on being. "I have been alone for a long time," she said against his shoulder. "So have I," he said. "I'm not entirely sure I know how not to be." "Neither am I," he said, "but I'd like to find out." The winter passed in the way that winters do when you are no longer waiting for them to end but have found enough warmth in the present to make the cold bearable. Virginia's work expanded. She had taken on the bookkeeping for Weatherspoon's store as well, since her reputation for numerical competence had spread with the speed that useful reputations travel in small towns, and Cornelius's evenings at Mrs. Pemberton's became less occasional and more expected. They were careful with each other in public, the way that a frontier town required, which meant that what passed between them was mostly conducted in the measured exchange of glances and the careful choreography of proximity and the particular warmth of conversations that meant several things at once. But in private, in the parlor evenings, they were less careful, which is to say more honest, and the honesty accumulated between them like something that was being built. He told her about the war in more detail. One February night when the wind was particularly cruel against the windows, and the parlor fire had taken on the character of a companion. He told her things he had clearly not told many people, and she listened without filling the silences with reassurance or redirecting him toward better thoughts. She understood that these were not stories looking for a response. They were burdens being shared, and the sharing was the thing. She told him in return about Thomas's last days, the part she had never told anyone, the specific texture of it, the way he had been lucid and afraid at the end, and how she had held his hand and told him they were almost there, almost to Oregon, which was not true but which was the only comfort she had to give. The way he had believed her or had decided to act as if he believed her, which amounted to the same thing. "You were kind to him," Cornelius said. "I was the only one there," she said. "That's not what I mean," he said. "You gave him something to hold onto when there was nothing real to hold. That's kindness. That's love." She looked at him across the fire. "Yes," she said, and it was the first time she had used that word in this context, and they both heard it, and neither of them made it into more than it was or less than it was. In March, the postmaster, a nervous man named Hicks who sweated profusely even in cold weather, arrived at Mrs. Pemberton's with a letter for Virginia that had come from the Territorial Land Office. She opened it at the breakfast table and read it with increasing interest. The letter concerned a small parcel of land 4 miles east of Harlan's Creek that had been purchased by Thomas Collins just before their departure from Ohio, as a down payment on their Oregon dream. The land had been bought cheaply and mostly on speculation, and Virginia had not thought much about it during the nightmare of the trail, because land seemed very abstract when you were trying to stay alive. But the letter informed her that the parcel was now formally registered in her name as Thomas's heir, and that recent surveys suggested the eastern fence line of the property ran along what was now being considered as a potential route for a stagecoach relay station. Virginia read this letter twice, very carefully, and then she folded it and walked to the marshal's office. Cornelius was at his desk going over some paperwork, and he looked up when she came in and immediately knew from her expression that something significant had happened. She put the letter on his desk without a word and watched him read it. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she had learned to read as him working through implications with the thorough patience that characterized his thinking. "This is valuable," he said. "Yes, and it's yours. Thomas bought it for both of us," she said, "but he's gone, so yes, it's mine. What do you want to do with it?" She looked at him steadily. "I want to build something on it," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the letter arrived. Something small first, a house. Then maybe something more. I was thinking about the relay station possibility, about what a relay station needs. Animals, feed, good water management. I know about managing resources under difficult conditions." She paused. "I know about managing resources under impossible conditions." His eyes were steady on her face. "That's a substantial undertaking." "I survived the Oregon Trail," she said simply. "I think I can build a house." He almost smiled, and then he actually smiled, and it transformed his face the way it always did, briefly making visible what was usually held close. "You can build anything you set your mind to," he said. "I think that was established on the first day I met you." They were quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the precision of someone raising a thing that needs to be raised, "I came to tell you because you should know, and because I wanted you to know." She paused. "And because I wanted to know what you think." "What I think," he said, and his voice had shifted into something more careful and more honest than his usual register, "is that the land is 4 miles east of town." A pause. "Which is 4 miles east of here." "Yes." He stood up from behind his desk and came around it and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and they were both very clear about what the conversation had become. "Virginia," he said, "I have been trying to find the right moment to have a particular conversation with you." "Have you? For some months?" "That seems like a long time to look for a moment." "I wanted to be sure," he said, "not of what I feel, that's been clear for a while, but of whether it was fair to ask." He looked at her with the direct, honest attention that was entirely characteristic of him. "You came here carrying a great deal. You built something here on your own because you are the kind of person who builds things on their own. I didn't want to," he paused, choosing his words. "I didn't want to be one more thing you were managing." She felt the truth of this land on her and considered it with the care it deserved. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had ever said to her about her situation, and it was said without any self-congratulation, simply as a statement of why he had waited. "Cornelius Yates," she said, and her voice was very steady. "You are the one person in this entire territory who has never made me feel like I needed to manage anything. You are the one person who sits still long enough to let me stop managing and just be." She paused. "You are the one person I told the true answer to when you asked how I survived." He looked at her for a long moment. "Anger," he said softly. "Anger," she agreed. "And then something else." "What's something else?" "I think you're part of it," she said simply. "I think arriving here and you and all of this, I think this is what comes after the anger, whatever the next thing is." He cupped her face in his hands with the same gentleness she had felt at Christmas, and looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, entirely real, and said, "I want to ask you to marry me, Virginia Collins. Not because you need someone to marry, and not because it would be practical about the land or anything else. Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and because every morning I wake up and think about talking to you in the evening, and that has been enough to make me look forward to every day for the past 6 months." She was quiet for a moment that was not hesitation but presence, being entirely in the moment with what had just been said and what it meant. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Was that too quick?" she said, and now the real laugh came, full and warm and completely unguarded. "No," he said, and he was laughing too, quietly, the way he laughed, not loudly but deeply, from somewhere real. "No, it was exactly right." He kissed her in the middle of the marshal's office of Harlan's Creek, Kansas, in the early spring of 1874, and it was a much less careful kiss than the Christmas one, and considerably more honest. Mrs. Pemberton, when told, burst immediately into tears of happiness and had to be persuaded to sit down with a glass of water. She recovered sufficiently to immediately begin planning a wedding that would be appropriate to the occasion, which in her view meant flowers from wherever flowers could be obtained in early Kansas spring, which was a logistical challenge she accepted with enthusiasm. The wedding was held on the 15th of April, 1874, in the Leaking Church, with Preacher Holloway officiating in a sermon that he kept, for once, appropriately short, apparently having been briefed by Mrs. Pemberton on the limits of everyone's patience. The Yellow Roses piano player contributed music of legitimate quality. Most of Harlan's Creek was present. The flowers that Mrs. Pemberton had managed to procure were modest but genuine and smelled like the actual spring. Virginia wore her best dress, which was navy blue because that was what she had, and she had trimmed it with new white at the collar and cuffs. She carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that had been found in the warming Kansas prairie and tied with a piece of ribbon. She walked into the church without anyone to walk her in because she was not a woman who required escorting, and the people who knew her understood this, and those who didn't learn it quickly. Cornelius was waiting at the front in a suit that fit him well and a clean white shirt, and the kind of careful attention to his appearance that told her he had thought about this morning a great deal. He looked at her as she came down the aisle, and his face did the thing it did sometimes, opened completely, everything visible, the full weight of what he felt entirely present. She looked back at him the same way. They said their vows with the serious attention of two people who understood exactly what promises were worth, and had both paid enough to know the price of making them lightly. When Preacher Holloway pronounced them married and Cornelius kissed his wife in front of a church full of people who were glad about it, someone in the back, it might have been one of the women from the Yellow Rose, let out a whoop of approval that echoed off the leaking roof and made everyone laugh. The celebration afterward at Mrs. Pemberton's was a genuine frontier feast, assembled from community contributions, with the generosity of people who understood that good occasions were worth celebrating. There was dancing of the practical and enthusiastic variety that frontier communities specialize in, and Virginia, who had not danced in over a year, found that she remembered how, with her husband's hand in hers on the floor of Mrs. Pemberton's parlor, the furniture pushed back, and someone with a fiddle playing something fast and bright. She was laughing, actually laughing, and Cornelius was looking at her with that expression of uncomplicated happiness, and she thought about anger and survival and all the hard miles it had taken to get here, and she thought that the trail had taken a terrible price, and that the anger had been real and justified, and that what was happening right now in this room, with this man, in this improbable small town on the Kansas plain, this was not in spite of all of that. It was somehow because of it. They moved into the boarding house initially, taking 2 rooms that Mrs. Pemberton consolidated into a small apartment with the ingenuity of someone who had been wanting to do something useful for them for months. But Virginia's land was the primary project now, and through the spring and into the summer they went out to it regularly, Cornelius on days when the town's demands could spare him, Virginia on most others, to survey and plan and begin the work of making something. The land was good. Not spectacular, not the lush green Oregon dream that Thomas had imagined, but honest Kansas land with solid soil and a reasonable spring, and a view of the horizon that went on forever in a way that Virginia had initially found oppressive and now found expansive. There were people in Harlan's Creek with building skills who could be contracted, and there was timber that could be brought in, and there was Virginia's detailed practical planning and Cornelius's contribution of 4 years of accumulated community knowledge about what worked in this particular territory and what didn't. Through the summer of 1874, they built a house. It was not a large house. 2 main rooms downstairs, 2 upstairs, a porch on the south side that caught the light. A kitchen that Virginia designed with the specificity of someone who had spent 6 months cooking over campfires and had opinions about what a proper kitchen should contain. A barn that went up first, because in Kansas you prioritize the animals, and a kitchen garden that Virginia planted with the same angry competence she brought to everything, coaxing things out of the ground with the force of her will. Cornelius kept his marshal's position. Harlan's Creek needed him, and he was good at it, and he found genuine meaning in it. And the house 4 miles east became the home they came back to at the end of each day, which was an arrangement that suited them both, giving her the independence and productivity she needed, and giving him the daily reminder that there was more to his life than the badge and the crooked porch office. In the evenings, after the work of the day, they sat on the south porch and watched the Kansas sky do the extraordinary things it did at sunset, all that space and color, the light going from gold to orange to a deep bruised purple at the horizon before the stars came out in their extravagant abundance. They talked about everything and nothing. They read together, passing books back and forth the way they had first passed the Christmas poetry. They were easy with each other in the way that two people become easy when they have both been honest enough for long enough that there are no significant surprises remaining, and the surprises that do occur are the welcome kind. There was one evening in late August, sitting on the porch as the light went down, when Cornelius said, out of a comfortable silence, "Do you still feel it, the anger?" Virginia considered this honestly for a moment, looking at the horizon. "Sometimes," she said, "when I think about Thomas and what the trail was, when I think about the other people who died." She paused. "When I think about how easily it could have been different if the wagon master had made better decisions, or if they had waited out the cholera instead of pressing on." She paused again. "But it's different now. It's not the thing keeping me upright. I don't need it to survive anymore." "What's keeping you upright now?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and the evening light was on his face, and he was watching her with the same steady, clear attention that had made her trust him from the beginning. "This," she said simply. "You, the house, the garden, the work, all of it." She looked back at the sunset. "I think the anger was for the crossing. This is for the arrival." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they watched the last of the sunset together, and then the first stars come out, and the Kansas night was enormous and quiet around them. And she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world was not something she was fighting but something she was part of. In the fall of 1874, Virginia discovered she was expecting a child. She told Cornelius on a Sunday evening, plainly and directly, because that was how she told him everything. He sat very still for a moment after she said it, and she watched his face move through something surprise, and then a settling of the surprise into something much larger and quieter. "Virginia," he said. "I know," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was responding to. He stood up and crossed to her and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression so full of everything that she felt it move through her like warmth. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm strong and healthy, and the house has a good room for a child, and I am not afraid." She paused. "I am not afraid," she said again, and this time it was not for him but for herself, checking the truth of it. "I know," he said. "You're never afraid, you're angry instead." "I suppose I will be furious if anything goes wrong," she agreed. And they were both laughing then, and he held her, and she let herself be held, which was not something she had ever found easy but had become, with him, something she chose rather than something she simply endured. Through the fall and winter she continued her work, the laundry accounts, the bookkeeping for Weatherspoon, her own household management, with the stubborn practicality of someone who was not going to be reduced by a pregnancy to a state of helpless waiting. But she was also, for the first time, allowing herself to plan forward into a future that felt genuinely possible and not merely hoped for. She was planting things, literally and otherwise. The kitchen garden had done well this first season, and she was already planning what to add in the spring. She was thinking about the relay station possibility, which had become more concrete as the stage routes were being confirmed. She was thinking about what a child would need, and making those preparations with the same thorough competence she brought to everything. Mrs. Pemberton, who had moved into a state of permanent loving anticipation about the baby, visited regularly and brought opinions and practical gifts and the depth of genuine affection. Cornelius was changed by the pregnancy in ways that were subtle but real. He was as steady as always. Steadiness was so fundamental to his character that it would have taken something seismic to alter it. But there was an additional warmth in him, a thoughtfulness that showed in small acts, in the way he came home earlier on difficult weather days, in the way he always noticed when she was tired before she mentioned it, in the way he had started reading aloud to her in the evenings without being asked because he knew she loved it, and it was a way of being present and useful simultaneously. One December evening, a year after their first Christmas together, she was in the kitchen and he was reading to her from the newspaper. They got the territorial paper, several days delayed, but still, and she set down the bread she was making and turned to look at him with flour on her hands and thought about the flour cloud in Weatherspoon's store almost 14 months ago, and felt the full arc of what had happened since with a clarity that was almost physical. He looked up from the paper and caught her expression. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, "only I was thinking about the flour. The flour. When we met, Weatherspoon's, the drover with the flour sack on his head." He set down the paper and looked at her with a smile that started in his eyes and moved down to his mouth with the slow warmth of something genuine. "I thought you might shoot someone. I thought about it," she admitted. "Instead, you argued me into silence in about 30 seconds. You were easily arguable. I was entirely convincable by a woman who knew what she was talking about," he said. "That was never going to be a fight." He paused. "Virginia, I knew something was going to change the moment I saw you standing in that flour cloud looking like you were deciding whether the world deserved to continue operating." She laughed. "What did you decide?" "That I wanted to know you," he said simply. "Whatever that turned out to mean." She crossed the kitchen to him with flour-covered hands and kissed him with the uncalculated directness of a woman who no longer had any reservations about this particular action. And he took her face in his hands as he always did and kissed her back with the specific attentiveness that had been, from the beginning, the way he did everything. Their son was born on the 4th of March, 1875, which was a clear, cold morning with the early spring light coming in sideways, and the prairie outside the window just beginning to show the first faint color of things waking up. The birth was attended by Mrs. Pemberton, who had considerable practical experience, and a woman named Dorothea Marsh, who had trained as a midwife in Missouri before coming west with her husband. Cornelius had been sent to the porch. He had not gone willingly. "You will be more useful out there," Virginia had told him with the authoritative calm she deployed when she needed things done without argument. "I would rather, Cornelius." He had gone to the porch. The boy arrived at mid-morning, strong and loud in the way of people who intend to make their presence known. When Mrs. Pemberton brought Cornelius inside and placed his son in his arms, something happened to his face that Virginia watched from the bed with a feeling in her chest that she had no adequate words for. He stood very still with the baby in his arms and looked down at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded, the most unguarded she had ever seen him, all his habitual steadiness replaced for just a moment with something that was simply astonishment and love. He looked up at her with eyes that were for once not steady at all. "Virginia," he said, "just her name, just that." "I know," she said. They named him Thomas Cornelius Yates, which felt right, the old name carried forward, the new name added to it, the two lives that had led here contained in 4 syllables. He was a good baby in the sense that he was healthy and loud and clearly possessed of a strong opinion about everything, which Virginia attributed to heredity. Harlan's Creek received the news of the baby with the enthusiasm of a small town for a good occasion. Gifts appeared at the house. Mrs. Pemberton, who had claimed the role of grandmother by sheer force of affection and proximity, was at the house more days than not for the first month. The women Virginia had come to know over the past 2 years came and brought practical things, and held young Thomas with the care of people who understood how precious new life was in a territory where the cost of bringing it into the world was not trivial. Spring arrived fully by April, and Virginia was back in her kitchen garden with Thomas in a basket nearby, directing the planting with the satisfaction of someone who is doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing and knows it. The house was a home in the full sense now lived in, full, marked with the texture of a life being made. The relay station proposal became real in the summer of 1875, when a representative from the stage company came to survey the route and confirmed that Virginia's land was indeed the preferred location for a station. The negotiation that followed was conducted by Virginia with a directness and competence that left the stage company representative slightly stunned, and resulted in terms that were fair and favorable, and that would provide a reliable income stream alongside the household operation. Building the relay station required additional hands, 2 men hired from Harlan's Creek, a father and son named Grover and Leland Sparks, who were reliable workers with good judgment about horses, and the station was operational by the following spring, which meant by 1876 the Collins Yates property was a functioning enterprise with a steady stream of stage traffic and the particular busy quiet of a place that has found its purpose. There were hard times in these years too, because it was the frontier and hard times were endemic. A dry summer in 1876 that stressed the garden and required careful water management. A winter illness that moved through Harlan's Creek and took Old Weatherspoon and 2 other longtime residents, leaving the town smaller and quieter. A period of some weeks when trouble from a cattle operation to the north threatened the stage route, which Cornelius handled with his customary combination of patience and firmness, and which Virginia supported by organizing the property owners along the route into a collective response that had considerably more legal and logistical weight than any individual complaint. They handled these hard times together, which was different from handling them alone, in a way that Virginia noted and valued with the measured appreciation of someone who knew precisely what alone felt like. They disagreed sometimes. She thought he was occasionally too measured where she would have moved faster, and he thought she occasionally moved too fast where a longer consideration would have been better. But they disagreed in the direct, honest way of 2 people who respect each other enough not to pretend, and the disagreements resolved themselves without lasting damage, because neither of them had the ego investment in being right that made resolution impossible. On a September evening in 1876, sitting on the south porch with Thomas, now 18 months old and deeply invested in the study of a beetle he had found on the porch boards, Cornelius said, with the casual directness he used for things that mattered, "I've been thinking about the deputy position." Virginia looked at him. "What about it?" "I've been trying to train up young Charlie Hendricks for 2 years. He's ready." A pause. "The marshal position isn't a young man's job forever. And there's more than enough work here." She looked at him steadily. "Is this what you want?" "I want to be here more," he said simply, "here with you and Thomas. The town is good and Charlie is ready," and he paused, looking for the honest word. "I'm ready for more of this." "Then do it," she said. He looked at her with a smile. "Just like that." "You've thought about it long enough," she said. "You're not a man who says things he hasn't thought through. If you say you're ready, you're ready." She paused. "But talk to Charlie first. Make sure he actually wants it." He did talk to Charlie, who did want it, and by October of 1876 Cornelius Yates handed the marshal's badge to a grateful and nervous Charlie Hendricks, and came home to the relay station property with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has made the right decision and knows it. There were mornings after that when she would find him on the porch at first light, drinking his coffee and watching the early light come across the Kansas plain, and she would bring her own coffee and stand beside him, and he would put his arm around her without looking up from the horizon, and they would stand together in the new day with young Thomas's early morning sounds coming from inside the house. She thought on these mornings about the trail, about Ohio and Thomas and the terrible crossing, about 61 people starting a journey and only one finishing it, about the anger that had kept her walking when everything in her wanted to stop. She thought about the morning she had arrived in Harlan's Creek with one mule and a bag of flour, and a heart so braced against the world that she had not known it could still open. She thought about a man in a dusty marshal's office who had looked at the scene of her small battle with the world and had not pitied her, not patronized her, not tried to fix her, but had simply looked and almost smiled, and had asked her questions and listened to her answers, and had understood what she said when she said anger, because he knew from the inside what that particular answer meant. She thought about all of it, and she felt the weight and the gift of it simultaneously, the way you can only feel something when you have lost enough to know how rare it is to have it. "What are you thinking about?" Cornelius said one morning, feeling her stillness beside him. "Everything," she said. "The trail, Ohio, all of it." He turned to look at her. "And this," she said. "Mostly this." She gestured the house, the land, the morning, him. He looked at her with those sage-green eyes and the expression that had become as familiar to her as the view from this porch, and said, "Good everything or hard everything?" "Both," she said honestly. "All of it together. That's how it actually is." "Yes," he said. He turned back to the horizon and then said with careful simplicity, "I'm glad you survived it." She was quiet for a moment. "So am I," she said. "I wasn't sure for a while that I should be, after Thomas. For a while it felt wrong to be glad." She paused. "It doesn't feel wrong anymore." He took her hand and held it, looking at the light crossing the plain, and she stood beside him and held on in return. The second child announced itself in the spring of 1877, and this pregnancy was easier in the sense that Virginia was established and healthy and surrounded by people who cared about her, and the work was hard but sustaining rather than desperate. She was 33 years old, and she felt, genuinely, like the best version of herself, not who she had been in Ohio, which was someone waiting for a life to begin, and not who she had been on the trail, which was someone surviving by the skin of her determination, but who she was now, which was someone who had built something real and knew its value, and woke up every morning with things she was glad to attend to. The second child was a girl, born on a warm October evening in 1877 when the harvest was in, and the relay station was quiet, and the light on the Kansas plain was the deep amber of a fall evening. She came into the world with less drama than her brother and more apparent serenity, looking at the people around her with an expression of focused assessment that made Mrs. Pemberton say, "She already looked exactly like her mother," which Virginia took as the highest possible compliment. They named her Rose Ellen Yates, the rose for the Kansas prairie roses that Virginia had brought into the house garden, and the Ellen for Cornelius's mother, who had died during the war and whose name he carried quietly. Thomas, now 2.5 and possessed of an alarming amount of physical energy and social confidence, inspected his sister with the serious authority of a child who has been the center of a household and has a great deal of opinion about any changes. He decided within 2 days that she was acceptable and possibly interesting, and by the end of the week was attempting to teach her things she could not yet do, which was so characteristic of the Collins persistence that Virginia had to leave the room so he would not see her laughing. Cornelius and young Thomas had developed a relationship that Virginia found quietly extraordinary to watch. Her husband was not a demonstrative man in the performative sense, but with his son, he was genuinely patient and fully present in a way that was more visible than his usual careful manner. He taught Thomas things about the horses, about the land, about how things worked, with the thoroughness of someone who believes that children deserve actual information rather than simplified versions. Thomas responded to this by following his father with the devoted attention of someone who has found his primary teacher, and the two of them could be found together at most hours of the day, doing something practical and absorbing. With Rose, who arrived later and whose character emerged as somewhat different, quieter, more watchful, interested in everything but expressive about less of it. Cornelius was equally devoted, but in a different register, attuned to her particular way of being in the world with the careful attention that was his fundamental character. Virginia watched all of this and felt the specific happiness of someone who has built the thing they didn't know they were building until they were already halfway through. In 1878, the railroad came through. Not through Harlan's Creek exactly, but close enough to change things, as railroads always did. The stage routes shifted and some of them declined, which required adaptation. The relay station's function changed: less stage traffic, more freight, and Virginia adapted with the practical speed of someone who had learned flexibility on 1,000 miles of hard road. The Sparks, father and son, proved adaptable too, and the operation continued, transformed but still viable. With the railroad came more people. The territory was filling in, the frontier contracting, the wildness that had characterized this land when Virginia arrived beginning to acquire the overlay of established civilization. She watched this change with complicated feelings. She had come here when it was rawer and harder, and the rawness had been terrible and the hardness had cost everything. But there was also something in the openness of that time that was gone now and could not come back. Cornelius, who had watched the territory change over many more years than she had, understood what she was feeling when she said it to him one evening. "It was never really about the wildness," he said thoughtfully. "It was about what you could build. The wildness just meant there was space to build it in. And now there's still space," he said, "just different kinds." She thought about this for a while. "I sometimes think about the other people on the trail," she said. "The ones who didn't make it, what they would have built if they had." "I know," he said. "Thomas would have been good at this," she said. "He was the one who wanted to farm. He would have been good at the work of it." "I think he'd have been glad it turned out to be yours," Cornelius said quietly. She looked at him. "A man who loves someone," he said carefully, "wants the good things for them. Even the good things that come from different directions than planned." She felt the generosity of this, the way he could speak about Thomas without the small, uncomfortable ego that lesser men might have brought to the subject. And she loved him for it with a specific, clear love that had nothing to do with the desperate love of survival and everything to do with the chosen love of two people who have decided, repeatedly and consciously, that this is the direction they face. "Yes," she said, "I think he would have been." The spring of 1879 brought a letter from Edmund Collins, Thomas's brother in Cincinnati. Edmund had apparently remarried after his first wife's passing, and his new wife had decided she was interested in the Western Territories and had persuaded Edmund to make a visit, and he was writing to ask if they might stop at Harlan's Creek on their way. Virginia showed the letter to Cornelius with a look that contained several opinions. "Do you want them to come?" he asked. "Edmund is not my favorite person," she said. "He wrote to me after Thomas died suggesting I return to Ohio for a suitable match." "I know," Cornelius said. "You told me." "He meant well," she said, with the careful fairness she applied even to people she found irritating. "He simply had no idea what I had already decided about my own life." She paused. "His new wife might be interesting. Anyone who convinced Edmund Collins to come to Kansas has some quality worth knowing." Edmund and his wife Clara arrived in June of 1879, and they were as different from each other as Virginia had perhaps hoped. Edmund was exactly what she remembered: well-meaning, slightly pompous, constitutionally incapable of entering a room without immediately assessing its organization. But Clara was a frank, bright-eyed woman from Pennsylvania who had married Edmund late, and had clearly decided he was a project worth undertaking, and Virginia liked her immediately. The visit lasted 4 days. Edmund was visibly and somewhat movingly surprised by everything, by the house, by the relay station operation, by the two children who were busy and real and entirely themselves, and most of all by Virginia herself, who was so clearly established and settled and confident in her life that his earlier ideas about suitable matches for her became obviously, even to him, somewhat absurd. On the second evening, Edmund sat on the south porch with Cornelius while Virginia and Clara were inside putting the children to bed, and when the two women came out later they found the men in a conversation that seemed genuine and comfortable, Edmund's usual excessive manner replaced by something more authentic. "He told me about the trail," Edmund said to Virginia as they were leaving. He was uncomfortable, which was not his usual state, and she understood it. "I knew Thomas died. I didn't know the full of it, the other 60 people," he paused. "Virginia, he stopped. "Edmund," she said, not unkindly. "It was a long time ago. I'm all right. I'm better than all right." She gestured at what was around them. "I built this." "I can see that," he said, and then, with more honesty than she had expected from him, "Thomas would have been proud." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think so." They said their goodbyes and Clara pressed Virginia's hand and said quietly, "I am very glad to have met you." And Virginia said sincerely, "And I you." And they wrote to each other afterward with the genuine correspondence of women who have found something worth maintaining. The years continue to accumulate in the way they do when a life is working as it should, not without difficulty or loss, because that was never the deal, but with a fundamental reliability, a sense that what had been built was solid and would hold. The relay station evolved into a small freighting operation. The house grew a room on the east side when it became clear that Thomas and Rose needed their own spaces, and that there was the timber and the means to provide them. The kitchen garden expanded to something more substantial, producing enough to sell at the Harlan's Creek Market that had established itself on Saturdays. Thomas Collins Yates grew into a serious, capable boy with his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a combination that served him well and gave his teachers both satisfaction and occasional exasperation. He was 12 by 1887 and already managing real responsibilities on the property, with the kind of quiet competence that his parents recognized and trusted. Rose, 3 years younger, had turned out to be the reader. She consumed books with the focused intensity of a natural scholar, and Virginia, who had walked the trail without a single book and had received that Christmas poetry volume like water in a drought, made sure the supply of books was maintained with the same priority she gave to flour and feed. In the evenings, as the years passed, Virginia and Cornelius continued the habit of the porch, the shared quiet, the conversation that had been going on since October of 1873 and showed no signs of exhausting itself. They knew each other now in the deep way of people who have been genuinely honest with each other over a very long time, and this knowing was one of the primary comforts of Virginia's life. The sense that she was known, completely and without revision, and still here, still chosen, still the person Cornelius reached for at the end of every day. He had aged well, the silver at his temples had spread, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there when she met him. But he was still the same person in all the ways that mattered, still steady, still honest, still the man who had sat with her on Mrs. Pemberton's porch in October of 1873, and listened to her give the true answer about anger without flinching or redirecting. She had aged too, in the visible ways that working hard in an open country ages a woman, and she had never much minded this because she had not spent the years doing nothing, and the age was evidence of that. She was 43 in 1887, and she was stronger than she had been at 20, in all the ways that the word could mean. One evening in August of that year, with the long summer light settling across the land she had built her life on, she was sitting on the porch and Cornelius brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her and said, as he sometimes said things out of a comfortable silence and into the same silence, "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" She thought about it. "Something about being effective," she said. "You said, 'I was not in the mood to be robbed today, Marshal.'" She smiled. "That sounds right." "I thought about that for days," he said, "the specificity of it today, as if there might be days when you'd accommodate robbery." "There are no such days," she said firmly. "I simply felt it needed clarifying." He was laughing and she was laughing, and the Kansas evening was golden around them, and the sounds from inside the house were the ordinary sounds of a family at the end of a day. Thomas's voice, Rose's quieter response, the domestic clatter of evening preparations. "Cornelius," she said. "Virginia. I'm glad I stopped walking when I got here." He looked at her with the full, honest attention she had loved from the beginning, the attention that had never wavered or diminished in 14 years of being directed at her. "So am I," he said, "every day." She took his hand and he held it, and they sat in the evening light, the two of them, with everything they had built around them, the house, the land, the children inside, the years behind them and whatever years were still to come. And the trail was a long time ago, and the grief was an old grief, and the anger had done its job and been allowed to rest. And what was left was this: solid, real, chosen, and entirely, sufficiently good. The stars came out above the Kansas plain with their usual unconcerned abundance, and Virginia Collins Yates watched them appear one by one in the darkening sky, and felt the full weight of what it meant to have survived, to have arrived, and to have made something worth arriving for. She had walked into Harlan's Creek carrying anger like a weapon, and had found, on the porch of a boarding house in October of 1873, a man who understood it, and had given it over slowly, by degrees, in the way you lay down something you've carried for so long you've forgotten what it felt like to have your hands free. And her hands were free now, and she was home.